understanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused. Hello and welcome to the third episode in the series of the Sunday Social. And today we're going to be talking about writing in the digital era, the digital age, and language teaching. And today I welcome Christopher Walker. So thank you ever so much for joining me, Chris.
Well, thank you very much for having me, Martin. It's a pleasure.
Okay. Okay, well, perhaps if you may, would you be able to introduce yourself to the audience, who you are and how you got into teaching and what you're doing now?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I've been a proper teacher, let me say, like self-qualified in terms of being proper for about 15, 16 years now. For the last couple, I've been working as the Director of Studies here in the south of Poland at International House Bielsko-Biała. And yeah, it's one of those names that's quite difficult to pronounce. And I've got some teachers who are coming to the end of their first year with us and they still haven't quite got the name down right. So and my mum used to send post to us, and the post office locally were heroic because they somehow managed to interpret what my mum had written as the address. It bore little relationship to the real address because she just couldn't kind of internalize the spelling. So yeah, I've been the Director of Studies here for a couple of years, but I've been doing like conferences and giving talks on a number of subjects. Writing was one of the first topics that I presented a conference talk about at IHTEFL Poland back in 2019, and it's always been a passion. I think that's also reflected in the fact that, as well as being the Director of Studies, I'm also the editor of the International House Journal, which brings me a lot of pleasure because it means that I get to spend a lot of my time working with writers, teachers who want to write. So they submit their articles to me, and I can go through and kind of do a global edit to see if the whole article works as it should, and then line editing would come later. But I enjoy it because you see kind of how people's minds work as you're going through, and it's useful practice for even in the classroom. You know, when you're teaching higher level students as well. The sort of techniques that you can use when you're editing any text. It works well in the classroom. So that's me.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you for your introduction. And so today, of course, we're going to be diving into the topic of writing, and particularly in the era where we're at in terms of AI and the digitalization of writing. And if we roll back, I suppose, when I first started teaching English, all those years ago, about 20 years ago, writing was considered one of those elements where it was pen and paper. And nowadays, of course, there's the element of writing or digital writing, or the digitalization of writing. And perhaps, if I may, could you share your initial experiences of the teaching of writing, maybe going back those years, and what was your experience like when it came down to writing?
Well, I think if I was to compare my early experiences of writing with how I approach it now, I wouldn't say that the technological aspect is the biggest change at all. If anything, it's more of a kind of paradigm shift for myself, where I am actually now engaged in the teaching of writing. A lot of teachers, when they talk about writing and writing skills, if they imagine a writing lesson, it's one that they might quite look forward to, because it means getting the students to sit down and be quiet for 45 minutes whilst they try to do a 200-word essay, and then the teacher would collect those papers up and then take them home, mark them and give them back and say, there we go, that was a writing lesson. Actually, that's a writing test. And I think that there's always been too much emphasis on the testing side, even if we don't know that it's testing that we're doing. When I kind of made the switch, because for the first few years of teaching, of course, I fell into the same sort of practices that everybody else did when it came to writing, if we did it at all. Usually writing was an afterthought because the students wouldn't really be that keen on it. And of course, they're not keen on it. If you say writing lesson and it means 45 minutes scribbling, nobody's going to go for that. In more recent times, I would say that my writing lessons have become more and more focused on like bottom-up skills, starting with crafting good sentences, building sentences into paragraphs, and finally looking at what it means to put a text together for a different target reader, whatever the case may be. But that actually is writing teaching. And I think that some of the other tweaks that I've made along the way certainly have helped with developing the teaching aspect there. I'm sure those will come up in our conversation very shortly. But on the tech side, I would say that by and large, I'm still using pen and paper, because pen and paper is very easy, scribble things out, look at reworking things. If you treat the first draft as kind of disposable, bit of scrap paper and a pencil, your students aren't really tied to it. They don't think, oh, this is my piece of writing, how dare you suggest that we rewrite it. But if you go in with just recycled paper and get the pencils out and say, oh, just throw any words you can down on the paper and we'll work from there. They don't feel they're not alarmed by any potential edits that come along, because it's all throwaway, and they kind of get on board with it a lot quicker. So yeah, there's been, I would say, first it was a revolution in how I approached writing lessons, followed by evolution of those lessons.
Yes, I feel much of what you've mentioned echoes into the experience of what I've gained over the years. And I suppose for me, one element that kind of was eye-opening was the fact of process writing. As you mentioned, many teachers and myself, and probably those with very little experience, focused on the final product rather than the actual steps in the process that had to be incorporated, such as the drafting or the brainstorming, and then the outlining, and then working towards a final piece of work that the students were proud of, and taking those small little steps to work towards it. And for me, I found that much more productive in the form of writing than just say, okay, we're going to go and test students and their grammatical accuracy based on what they're able to write within 45 minutes.
Exactly.
Yeah. And let's have a look at maybe the digitalization, the how AI has kind of shaken up the world of writing.
It has, hasn't it? Yeah,
it has. Yeah, and there's probably if not all teachers having to combat the issues of either plagiarism or copying directly statements that are auto-generated from a large language model. What would your suggestions be for teachers when it comes down to how best to incorporate AI within their writing lessons?
Well, I think to do that, we have to first remember what AI is. And I came across a tweet, or whatever they call tweets these days, that I thought was incredibly to the point. It summarized the whole world of AI in just 3 words. AI is a solved problem solver. Yeah. So whatever problem you're approaching AI with, somebody somewhere in the world has already solved that problem. And the solution just needs to be drawn from the terabytes or exabytes or whatever it would be of data that's out there. And that's what makes ChatGPT in itself so very good, is that it can draw all of that in a way that we find a little bit more approachable than with reliance on an original kind of Google search approach, hoping that one of the pages that we land on will have some of the answer we're looking for. Instead of that, it's generated based on the product of all of those pages. So if we think of AI as being a solved problem solver, my suggestion for teachers would be to make sure that any writing that you give to your students to do should be an unsolved problem. Let me give you an example. So if I ask my students to do a C1 advanced writing task, an essay where they've got to look at certain aspects of, let's say, traffic, the problems that traffic produces in any given city. Well, people have been thinking about these problems for a long time. So the solutions rather, exist out there. You ask ChatGPT to put together a good essay of about 240 words or whatever on that topic, it will do that. And then the students will be very tempted just to do it that way, because really they know that the teacher isn't going to pay very much attention to the content of what they've written. The teacher is going to seem more interested in the language features and things like that. So the motivation for a student to actually do that piece of writing, to really engage with it, is very low. It's a little bit like if you went into the classroom as a student every day and the teacher said, "Oh, hi, how are you?" And you're like, "Fine, thanks, but I'm a bit tired." And he's like, "Okay, yeah, but how are you?" "Good." "Okay, thank you." "How are you?" "Okay, good, thank you." Not interested in the response, not interested in the students and their thoughts, but rather just doing it because it's a box to tick. So if our writing becomes just a box ticking exercise, then it's going to lead to students not really caring what they produce and then getting ChatGPT to do it. So if we stick with this original example then of an essay about the traffic situation in your city, somebody's written about it already, the teacher's not going to show very much interest in it, it's going to end up with the students just going in and feeding the prompt into ChatGPT. However, tweak it so that you're still getting a good essay and it's still going to be on the right sort of topic with the right sort of language. Get the students to think about the street that they live on. What's that street like? What problems do you have that are traffic related? Is there a lack of parking for the local inhabitants? Does it get really busy because there's a school along the street, so you can't really drive freely from one end to the other? Is it part of a one-way system? There are a lot of factual details that you can introduce, and then you look at the consequence of those factual details, but you're also communicating something that is actually quite intensely personal. I mean, I could talk for ages about the traffic situation around where I live, because I've basically had to give up on using things like Uber Eats or whatever the equivalent is, because nobody can really find our block. Our block was built during the 60s when it was the communists that were planning everything, and they were like, people don't have cars, why would they need parking? Come on. So our block is isolated from the parking. It's not really on a street as such. And once we had pizza that arrived cold, because the guy got close to our apartment, spent 20 minutes walking around the block in circles until finally we managed to call him to say, hey, this is where we are. He's like, what? How is it even possible that you live there? He'd walked past the place 3 times without realizing. So, it leads naturally to an interesting piece of writing that the students would actually want to share, provided the teachers prioritize feedback on content. And I think that's the other key thing here, is that there's too much focus on correcting language mistakes in written work. The students don't really want that first. They might want it later, if at all, or you could just integrate any kind of corrections that you want to do into future teaching. But it really is key that the first thing that you do, the thing that the student appreciates most, is that you give feedback on the content that they've produced. If they do a piece of writing and our first response is like, yeah, but why is it all one paragraph? The student will be like, yeah, but teacher, have you read it? I've poured my heart and soul into this. And if all we do is say it should be 4 paragraphs, next time they get a rubric to do, they'll put it into ChatGPT and we'll have lost them. So you've got to make it worth the student doing. You've also got to kind of avoid the situation that something like ChatGPT could do it for them. If it can't do it, and it really can't if it's that deeply personal, that solves a lot of the problems. You're making the writing more worthwhile. You're giving a reason to the student for doing it. They're not going to want to do ChatGPT for it.
It's interesting that you've mentioned about the personalization of writing, because a number of years ago, I think it was 2 years ago, around 2 years ago when ChatGPT was launched, and there was a huge, surge towards, this is a fascinating tool, and obviously it impacted my classroom, and my
Hmm.
context is teaching, students, university students, international students, presentation and writing skills. And within the writing elements of the course, I gave them just a generic piece of writing for them to research and draft and produce and submit, without any thought of this new tool that had come
Hmm.
into existence. And then as the semesters went by and I developed the course itself, I focused more and more on the reliance of personalization, personal topics,
Hmm.
and getting students to focus on what is the impact on them, and having that dialogue with
Yeah.
students when it comes down to writing, and that dialogue of, AI is available. It's a very powerful tool, or technological tool, but how can it be used or abused, I guess, when it comes down to your writing? And I suppose my next question is really about the potential, the use.
Hmm.
I've got my own thoughts and ideas about how ChatGPT or Google's alternative software AI model could be used within writing classes. But what sort of thoughts do you have when it comes down to AI and how it could be used in the classroom?
Um, well, I was very resistant to using AI in the beginning because I was like, oh, I'm quite old.
Mm,
Is it really necessary for me to learn this, or can I just
mm,
live without it? But then I started playing around with it a little bit, and yeah, I was quite blown away with the possibilities. I suppose really I could separate the discussion here into what does it mean for the teacher in terms of producing materials and the use in the classroom, that side of
mm,
things, and the use for a writer who wants to write but still wants to integrate ChatGPT into the workflow. So maybe I'll start with the teaching side a little bit. And one of the ways in which things like ChatGPT really excel is that it's great at producing models that are customized. So you go to
mhm,
ChatGPT. Let's say that you're teaching B2 first exam class. You're starting to look at writing with your students. You want your students to have an appreciation of how assessment works, knowing full well that it's not all down to lexis and grammar. There's also communicative achievement, there's content,
mhm,
there's organization to work on. How do you get all of this across? Well, one of the simplest ways would be to take the same rubric and produce different model answers that
mm,
vary in one very specific way each time. So you could ask ChatGPT, produce me a response to this rubric that would score 5 in everything, but only 2 in communicative achievement, for example. And then 5 in everything, but 2 in organization, 5 in everything, but 2 in language. Then give those models the output of that prompt to your students and ask them to connect one to the other. So which one of these is falling down on organization? Read through it,
mhm,
decide, and tell your partner why it's that one, and then we'll talk about what that means for us as writers going into the exam. Students benefit from this, and teachers do as well, because whenever I do workshops on grading writing according to the
mhm,
assessment frames that Cambridge produce, my teachers are always begging for similar but different models. So they're like, okay, so if this one got 3 for this, why does this one get 4 for this? But they're different responses from different rubrics. What they want is the
mhm,
same rubric consistent across the board, so that they can look
mm,
at the fine detail. And
mm,
ChatGPT and the like can give you that. So that's one way in which you can use it. Another way that I've been doing it, it's not really it's not really writing so much, but I quite like it as a little stocking filler, I suppose, little activity that you do towards the end.
mhm,
Let's say that you've been looking at vocabulary for a particular topic. Let's say it's furniture, which is one I did recently. You've got 10 minutes of the lesson left. The students look exhausted. So you say, close the books. Okay. I'm going to get ChatGPT to tell us a story, but the story is going to include 6 vocabulary words from this area. First, with your partner, guess which 6 there will be. Then I'll get ChatGPT to write a short story up to 100 words, click to read aloud, and then the students get to check their predictions. And then as a nice little follow-up task, I can say, okay, what did you like about the story and what would you change? They can tell me what they would change, and I'll tell ChatGPT to do it. So, for example, we did this vocabulary thing, and the students said, yeah, it was good, it was funny, but we wish it had zombies. So I was like, all right, ChatGPT, great story. Could you tell it to me again with zombies? So it did. Because, what else is it going to do? Say no? Now, I know that's not exactly connected to writing, but it is still a pretty fun use that I've found for it. So on the teaching side, there are certainly a lot of opportunities there. Where it gets really interesting is on the writing side. And this is something that I've been going into in a very big way recently, because I am a bit of a writer myself. It's one of my hobbies. I write short stories. I would love to write more novels, but it's a big commitment of time and mental energy to shape the whole thing. And I also write stories for the entertainment of my 2 daughters. I've got one who's 10 and one who's 13. The 13-year-old doesn't want to hear it. The 10-year-old wants to hear as many stories as I can possibly come up with. Now, I'm not going to get ChatGPT to make the stories because that would be terrible. But I can get ChatGPT to do the literary analysis afterwards. So I'll write a short story. I'll go to ChatGPT and tell it what I've done and say, would you mind having a look and tell me if you think it's appropriate for the person I'm writing it for? So I then upload a file, because it's usually a little bit over the word count that you can post as a normal prompt. It will go through and it will say, yes, these areas are perfect for your target. However, here were some sentences that they might find a little bit too long or complicated. You could consider rewriting them. It always asks if I want help rewriting them. And I'm like, no, I'd like to do it myself. So I do that. I go through, I put in some editing, and then re-upload the file and say, what do you think? Is this any better? And for me, working here in Poland, where there are very few other writers around, there's like a writers group in Krakow that I can never quite get to because it's a couple of hours away. There aren't any teachers who are fiction writers. There are very few readers around, readers of English anyway. If I'd been born 100 years ago, I might well have found myself part of a literary salon. If I'd gone to university to study English instead of physics, which is what I did, I might have made friends just like Christopher Hitchens did with Martin Amis and James Fenton. They had their little group. They became friends with people like Saul Bellows, so they were bouncing ideas back and forth, probably sending their writing off, just like Hemingway did with Gertrude Stein, I think. So in the past, writers used to hang out with writers and they would get ideas off each other, and somebody's style would then rub off on another writer's style. I'm bereft of all of that. But what I do have now is the perfect reader in ChatGPT, where I'll send it a story and it will analyze it, tell me if it's strong, if it's weak, if it needs tidying up, things like that. And one time recently, I was blown away by it. Because I'd written this story where for the first 2/3 it was a straight up story, and then it stopped and it turned out that somebody was narrating the story to somebody they'd met, which is an old literary device beloved of people like Somerset Maugham, one of my favorite writers. Now, I've never told ChatGPT that I like Somerset Maugham, but it read this story and it said, wow, it feels like it's really influenced by Somerset Maugham. And I was like, oh my goodness, how does it know this? Like, I never told it this. It's just managed to derive that from some aspect of the writing. And honestly, like, if a friend had told me that, that's a friend for life, honestly. So ChatGPT telling me this sort of thing, it's very kind of positive reinforcement. It is very good at doing that sort of thing. So when it comes to sorry, go ahead.
So I suppose that's where students could benefit from having that feedback, that guide, where it's like, this is great.
Exactly.
Have you considered X, Y, and Z?
Exactly. Yeah. So you can even get ChatGPT to play like to be the teacher before the teacher. So if you're a student, you've just done your writing, you could then say, my teacher gave me this as my homework. This is my attempt. Can you tell me, just generally, do you think the teacher will be happy with what I've produced here? Do I explain myself clearly enough here? Have I organized my thoughts clearly enough? Now, the difficult part for students, just as for anybody, would be when ChatGPT says, I can help make it better. If you say yes, that's okay. It's perfectly okay as long as you learn from the experience, just as with working with an editor. I hope that as the editor of the journal, when people send me their work and I go through and edit it, I like to think that the writer has learned something useful from that experience, and that next time they write something, they'll be a little bit more efficient and effective about it. I would hope the same is true for students. If ChatGPT introduces some changes, I hope that they learn from those changes.
Yes. Well, I'm just going to bring in today's sponsorship for this show, and this show's brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, the publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. So level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of their titles and use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your next order.
Very generous.
Okay, well, it's an interesting point that you mentioned when it comes down to incorporating that immediate feedback. And obviously, as educators ourselves, we're not fully aware how much students are taking in that feedback because it's just so automated. The feedback could be just received and like, great, okay, that's it. I'll forget about the process between what I've written and what has been recommended. And I suppose that's the potential issue if no learning has taken place and it's just a replacement of what's been produced by the student.
Yeah, that's always a possibility, but I think that the same is true with feedback from the teacher directly. And I've seen this myself when teachers sit down with a piece of homework or an example from, I don't know, exam practice or something like that, and they go through and they have like a system where they'll underline in red if it's a spelling mistake, and they'll highlight in blue if it's word order, and they do all of this, and it takes 45 minutes to 60 minutes for a single piece of writing, and then they deliver it back to the student, who glances at it, says, oh, thanks very much, folds it up and puts it in their backpack. You know, there's a huge amount of teaching hours out there being wasted preparing in-depth feedback that is a solved problem already. We know how these problems originate or where they come from or how to fix them. So relying on the teacher to put in the hours, I would even go so far as to suggest that teachers who want to give that sort of feedback ought to either scan the text that they're given by their students and get ChatGPT to grade it, or just do it all via email or Google Classroom or what have you. So I think that you could really hand over a lot of the responsibility for correction to something like ChatGPT. I still think it's useful for the teacher to go through like a supply of essays and see what the common problems are that their students have. But I would focus less then on the language issues and more on things like, okay, the student is not good at developing ideas. They introduce something, it's very superficial. They don't look at the consequences. They can't offer a justification for anything they say because they've not ever really had to. They've never really been forced to go deeper into a topic. So I need to work on that skill rather than just the system of the correct application of tenses in different situations.
Yes, that's a interesting point, because one point that I try and drive my students towards is, you know, that critical thinking when it comes down to writing, and getting the students to share exactly what are your opinions about the particular topic. You know, they're very good at generating their ideas, or very superficial ideas. Let me think about a particular topic I got students to look at. It was very generic, and it was about remote work and the implications for business. And you know, they were very quick at finding advantages and disadvantages and maybe recommendations. But it's like, okay, that's all well and good, but what's your opinion? What's your ideas? And it's just for students and writers, it's finding their voice and sharing their voice, and you know, what sort of recommendations would you have for teachers that want to try and develop their students' written voice?
Okay, well, I think that actually the problem is a little bit more widespread than we realize. So most of my teaching is in what we might call a communicative classroom. You know, it's not where the students come in, sit down, be quiet, open the book, and do the next exercise. It is driven by speaking. We do a lot of speaking practice. It's really the unique selling point of schools like International House. So you take state school students who have that kind of traditional translation effect, basically. Like, here's the Polish and this is the English for that Polish. Now sit down and learn these 2 pages of vocabulary items for a test. There's no speaking for a whole week. So when we bring students in, we prioritize speaking over everything else. Lots and lots of speaking. However, the majority of that speaking is dialogic. You get the students talking to each other. They have their interlocutor. And if they notice from the expression on the other person's face that there's been a loss of understanding, they can repair that straight away. They make a point, the other person says, yeah, but what do you mean? And then they can go back into it. So if most of their speaking practice is dialogic, it means that they've not had very much time or much experience of really building ideas by themselves. That translates most obviously in the situation of writing, where there is no interlocutor, but also in monologues. So I think that if a teacher notices that there is this problem, instead of going straight in with the writing, which is going to drain the energy from the students if they have to write a more extensive piece where they're really introducing something and developing the ideas as fully as possible, one way to practice the skill of idea development would just be to get them to do more monologues in class, maybe with the aid of a PowerPoint behind them to help structure their thoughts, so that they can talk on their own without support from a partner for more than 30 seconds. So start by introducing the point, and then just silence greets it. You wait, see if they can develop it. If they get stuck or they try to go to another point, you say, no, let's stay with that point. Tell me more about it. What does it mean? What would the opposite mean? What if we don't do this? What would the outcome be? So you give some scaffolding at the start, but you want to train your students to be able to take an idea, hold it up to the light, turn it around, and investigate it from different angles. Because if they can't do that, it doesn't matter if it's speaking or writing. That's the productive element. They need to have that central skill of building ideas in the first place. And in today's society, with short attention span theater on your mobile device, people aren't used to developing ideas. They watch something that is just the superficial idea, then they go, oh, okay, but it's finished already, and they're on to their next Instagram reel.
Yes. I suppose if I think back, when it comes down to trying to develop those skills for students, whether it's either of the productive skills, if I recall, I think it was Adrian Underhill. He mentioned like demand high teaching, or it might have been
there was something
Scrivener.
like that. I think it was Underhill, wasn't it? Underhill, probably Thornbury was in there, because it's always Thornbury, isn't it? There are like 3 people in ELT these
Yes.
days.
But I think it was demand high teaching or
Yeah.
high demand teaching, but
It was demand
demanding
high.
more.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. I didn't like the phrasing, to be honest. I mean,
No, no.
as
As
like,
if you're the teacher and you're demanding more from your
well,
students.
yeah. Yeah.
Or
I mean,
please,
if
sir,
you,
may I have some more?
it's something like that, isn't it? I mean, the principle is certainly there. I think it has been
Mm,
abandoned a little bit because perhaps some students were finding that they couldn't do it, or they didn't have the fortitude to actually persevere with
mm,
doing that. Just a quick one word, one sentence response was always enough for them. But this is what
mm,
separates people who can take the B2 first and get a good grade from those who can do the
mm,
C1. And when you get to C2 and the individual long term in the C2 proficiency is 2 minutes
mm,
uninterrupted, a lot of students find that they cannot do it. They can't get past a minute because they've already burnt through the prompts on the card. But once they learn these techniques, once they practiced it, I found some students who were able to talk for 2 minutes just about the first prompt on their card. They went so deep into it. And
mm,
the other thing here is that if we are superficial in our thoughts, we're also going to be superficial in our language. Yeah. You ask a
mm,
student, what did you think of that film? The superficial response, yeah, the film was quite good, actually. Yeah, it was all right. It's like, okay,
mm,
you only need B1 for that.
mhm,
And then if you say, okay, let's go a little bit deeper. Tell me a bit more about the story. And they say, okay, well, actually, no, there were a few plot holes that kind of interrupted my enjoyment of the film.
mm.
Already, that one sentence is a letter higher, isn't it? Or half a
Yes.
level higher, just because they're
Mm,
going in a little bit deeper. And then if
mm,
they'd said, I think if it hadn't been for the writers' strike of last year, then perhaps the film would have been better. Like the story would have
mhm,
made more sense. And you go, wow, there we go. So we've got an unreal or hypothetical conditional suddenly thrown into the mix
mhm,
because they've gone
mm.
deeper. They're looking at the
Yeah.
reasons for something happening. So if you are superficial in your ideas, you'll be superficial in your language. And it's going to
Mm,
reflect in the sort of grades you get when you're studying. A lot of people, it doesn't really matter. They can go through life with just that sort of superficial language in another language, and it's fine. I mean, I can't do it in Polish. I can hardly express myself at all. And I've been here a decade and a half, going on 2 decades. It's but then all my time is taken up with English, so I've got a good excuse. Or so I tell my daughters when they're like, "Daddy, why can't you go to Parents' Day instead of Mummy?"
Yes, well, I'm much like you. I feel rather embarrassed, despite me being, connected with Korea in one way or another for almost 2 decades.
Mm.
It-
Teachers
but
often make
but
the worst students, don't they?
yes, they do. But then I suppose for us, having the attempt to have learned another language, it does show how or what challenges that learners may encounter when it comes to their
Hmm.
second
Oh
language.
yeah.
Yeah. Um, Now, obviously, the assessment of writing, particularly within a formal environment, whether it's in university or in the Cambridge main suite exams, um, or the like. When it comes down to written assessments, and from my personal experience, assessing writing can be entire. It's become even more tricky now with AI and technology, and
Hmm.
I'm trying to navigate this murky world of AI generated text and assessing writing based on what the students have produced or not. It's a very, very difficult environment. And what sort of how would you go about these new forms of written assessments, and is there anything you're experimenting with, such as maybe reflective journals or process projects, portfolios, or that sort of thing when it comes down to writing?
Well, assessment is a tricky thing in this industry because on the one hand, you've got students who are studying for the IELTS or they're studying for a Cambridge exam. So as the teacher, you need to be in a position to make a good analysis of where they are and what sort of level they've reached, what sort of grade they can expect in the exam. But within the school itself, progression is more or less guaranteed from year to year, simply because they are paying clients. And if we tell a 16-year-old student, I'm sorry, but you shouldn't go up to the next level next year, all that happens is the parents come in the following day and say, well, look, we either go up to the next level or we take our kid elsewhere. And then because it's a business, we're like, okay, well, sign this form to say that at least we've told you that they shouldn't, and we'll just go with it. I remember having a class of adults not too long ago preparing for the B2 first exam. One of them I knew had failed the exam, and I saw him at school at reception, and I was like, oh, are you coming back to sign up for another course then? He's like, yes, I tried the next level. I was like, but you failed the exam. Why are you trying the next level? So for him, it doesn't matter. For most students, it doesn't matter what we do in school. So I would say that if you've got an exam preparation class, you need the students to understand that any assessment that you do is for their benefit, and that if they do use AI to help them along the way, they have to understand that they won't take AI with them into the exam room. There's just no way to do it. So they're only lying to themselves. If the teacher says that they get full marks for their writing, but it wasn't their writing, as long as they know that the teacher has marked it assuming that they wrote it themselves, they can't turn around and say, well, I failed the exam, but you promised me I'd get a high grade. And the teacher can just say, yeah, I gave you a high grade based on what you showed me. If you didn't write what you showed me, what do you expect? If the assessment mattered within the school, like in a mock exam or something like that, the solution is simple. Just go handwritten. Get the students to actually write it out by hand. One of the things that I've told some of my students who are really pushed for time, because I know now that my daughters are getting older, I know just how much work is involved in schooling outside of school hours. And sometimes the students just don't have the time to do the homework, but they don't want to lose face by not doing it at all. So they do get ChatGPT to write it for them. I tell them, okay, if ChatGPT wrote it for you, I'd like you to do one of two things, but in either case, the outcome is going to be you write it by hand. Either copy what ChatGPT gave you onto a piece of paper, or read what ChatGPT gave you and try to write as much as you can remember from the output on a piece of paper. Either way, it's going to be written by hand, so there was some work involved. But if you use ChatGPT and it did the hard work of thinking for you, okay, I'll live with it. I'll accept it. And for those students, my hope is that in the long term, simply the act of copying will give them enough formulaic language that on the day of the exam, they can go in and they can get a good pass. Because writing itself is remarkably formulaic. I mean, unless you're trying to be creative, you use the same structures again and again and again for any kind of essay. Or if it's a report, it's an even more kind of limited range of structures. So if the student gets, if ChatGPT writes every C1 advanced report for a particular student, and I expect them to copy every single one out onto paper before submitting it, they'll actually be much better at writing reports by the time they go into an exam than somebody who'd never practiced, regardless of the use of AI. They'll have kind of absorbed by reading and reproducing. I mean, this is what writers used to do. Writers used to take a book that they liked and they would copy out passages or learn them by heart.
True. That's true. Yes, that's a very good point. And when it comes down to like the IELTS exam, where it's part one or part two, but more so within part one of the writing of IELTS, it uses this formulaic language and this ever predictable language over again and again and again, which is good. And if students are aware of how that language is being used and they can incorporate it for that particular exam, that's great. But the creativity, the voice of the student, I think, is more important when it comes down if they're wanting to produce something personal as well. But anyway, right, I'm just going to just do a quick shout out to John Catt Educational, who are the sponsors for this podcast. They're publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. So level up your professional development today and visit johncatbookshop.com to explore their full range of titles. And you can use the code whilst ordering JCTTR2425 for 20% off your next order. Right. Well, I'm going to move on to maybe portfolio writing, if I may. And one thing that I am going to be experimenting with my university students is the use of portfolios, and where students have to create some piece of writing, but they have to build up a physical piece of writing, pen and paper, but all that has to be produced within the class, and it works over a number of weeks. What is your experiences when it comes down to students creating a portfolio in that manner?
I think we can kind of echo what we'd started with when you asked me how to kind of overcome some of the disadvantages of access to AI, which is that students will use AI to cheat. They will only cheat if they don't care about what happens with the writing that they produce. So if you have students who are working on a project of any kind and they will care about the result of that project, if they have some sort of ownership and they can take pride in their work, then I think that the outcomes that you'll be looking at will be remarkably different. So, for example, last year, I worked on a project with a couple of other teachers and friends outside of teaching and a couple of students, and we put together an anthology. It's called Please the Threes, and it's available on Amazon for basically the lowest price that I could set it to. And it includes the work of several of my own students and some writers and other teachers. And it's published, like they can actually get the book and their name is on the cover of that book. So, for example, I had a student who wasn't really into creative writing, but he did like nonfiction stuff. So together we researched the interesting stories of a couple of football players in the last couple of generations. One was Santi Cazorla, I forget the name of the other, but he was a Polish guy. He was like the next big thing, but he snapped his Achilles and he never got over the injury. Santi Cazorla had a much worse injury of his Achilles, and it got so bad with an infection that it looked like he was going to lose the whole foot. But then he managed to, through the right kind of modern therapies, he was able to actually restart his career. So we looked into it, we did some research, we put a text together, we wrote it together in the class over a number of lessons. And when we were finally happy with the result, comparing these two footballers and the experiences they'd had, it went into the anthology along with some other work by some students. And I think that there was never even the suspicion of us using AI to help along the way, because this was going to be something that was going out into the public domain that would be attached to the name of that person. I think with one or two of the students who were included in this project, I think it made up part of their university application. My work appeared in this volume that's available through Amazon. Fantastic. So they had a real reason to care and to write the best thing that they possibly could. And it was astonishing because even when I'd gotten to the stage where I was pretty happy with the work that they'd produced, they were like, no, I'm sure if we edit it some more, we could make it better. So we were going back in for a fresh round, and their voices did come through, maybe not in terms of style, because writing style is actually a very, woolly concept. It's difficult to really know what a writer's style is unless it's very specific to the writer. I mean, we know what Hemingway's like with and. But besides that, it would be quite difficult to place writing with a particular writer. But the choice of topic and the approach to the topic and their kind of viewpoints that would come through in the writing all of those were reflected very strongly. One student that I worked with was, what was the term? Arrow Ace, I think. This is one of the LGBTQIA things. Can't admit that I'm particularly up on that myself, but I did learn a lot from her, because she said, I never see myself presented in stories. And I was like, okay, so make that your character. And she did. So she had that character at the heart of her story, and it did work quite well. It went into the book, and I think she was very happy to actually say, hey, look, I've got some representation out there. I had to do it myself, but I cared. So yeah.
And I guess the collaboration, that collaborative work that you did, and if there are teachers, educators that are listening, maybe the step forward would be collaborating a piece of work with your students, getting them involved with a piece of work that is going to have some impact, or is going to be published or not, as long as there's some collaborative interaction taking place between the educator and the students.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think of a topic that people care about and have a personal opinion about, you could imagine getting 20 students from 20 different countries to write 300-400 words about it with the help of their teacher or with the help of their classmates, put it all into one pot, bundle it up with maybe the same from a few other topics, and before you know it, you've got a book, and that book then can go out there and it can be made available. I mean, we're talking less than $1 for the Kindle version of this anthology that we worked on. So I mean, it's well within the buying power of the students. I would have made it free if it was a possibility on Amazon, but they want to take their slice, and there's no slice for free. But it's there. So if you've got students who really want to share this, I mean, you can see it with teachers themselves. There was a publication that came out very recently that was attached to Scott Thornbury, which was about dogma in practice, I think it was.
I think that's right, yeah.
It was just a set of like 50 or so anecdotes from teachers. I actually did a chapter myself, but it's right at the end. So only those who have had plenty of coffee will perhaps make it that far. It's the problem with being Christopher Walker instead of Christopher Olker or something like that. I'm always at the end. But, there were teachers who cared enough about teaching using dogma for this book to then see the light of day. And I'm glad that it's out there, because there are teachers who can add that to their CV. You can add writing for the IH Journal to your CV. If you just write something that's interesting. But what's really disheartening is I have received articles from people clearly written by AI. I mean, there are ways to check. You can use 0GPT to see if something seems AI inspired. The problem with those sort of tools is that it can give you a false positive if something's being translated automatically. So if it's being written in another language and then Google Translate handled the conversion, then it will say that's AI. But usually it doesn't pass the smell test. If you read something and at the end of it you say, okay, yeah, that was 1,000 words, but I haven't learned anything. You've not told me anything. And again, it comes back to this idea that AI is a solved problem solver. The idea of a good article, one that has a personal resonance, is that here is a problem that I don't think someone had solved before. This is my take on it. Like, how do you teach children to read when it means getting them to sit down with you and actually look at a book? AI can help give you some ideas, but if you want to make it experiential, it's not going to be AI that does the writing. It's going to be you, because it's your solution to that problem.
That's an interesting point. And one thing that I do share with my students is I give them 2 models of writing on the same topic from the previous semester, and I say, okay, this student wrote something, and just have a quick read, just 1 minute of this paragraph. What are your thoughts? What are your ideas? How could it be improved? And then I share a second piece of writing a paragraph on the same topic, and I tell the students exactly the same instructions. And I say, okay, let's switch them off, switch off the IWB, the interactive whiteboard, and which one's more memorable?
Mm.
And they really go for the latter, the last paragraph. I said, well, and invariably that one's filled with a number of maybe punctuation mistakes, grammatical mistakes, but it's incredibly personalized,
Mhm.
and
Yeah.
you take something away from it, whereas maybe the first one is very generic, very there's very little substance to it. It's
Yeah.
and I said, well, is there anything you remember from the first one? They said, well, no, not really. And I say, well, and my main aim for that is to tell the students, well, I'm more interested in finding out about your own personal experiences, and I'm not interested in grammatical mistakes and spelling mistakes, punctuation issues.
Yeah.
And hopefully that just draws that attention towards students in the classroom going, this is what I need to do. This is where we're heading when it comes down to writing.
And they'll be so much more engaged after that. They'll be like, aha,
Mm,
now I understand the teacher's expectations, because a lot of students will arrive in that classroom expecting
mm,
you to care most about the language that they use and not so much about the ideas. And I look at
mm,
the Polish classroom with dismay, and I think so many opportunities are missed because the teacher wants the students to reproduce the ideas that the teacher has already delivered. You do literary analysis. Well, you have to say the things about this book that have been said before. So, of course, ChatGPT is going to do as good a job as any. If you have some thoughts that don't go in line with what the teacher expects, you would write them yourself. But then if you think that the teacher is going to criticize you for it, you're going to cheat. But if you have that sort of open atmosphere, and I love this idea that you've got this example, it really kind of it shows the students, I care about you. And as long
mm,
as they know that and they are secure in the knowledge that the teacher cares first and foremost about them, they're going to be a lot more inclined to engage with the writing tasks that they've got.
mm. Yeah. Well, let's finish off with maybe your favorite writing tasks that you like to incorporate into your classes. You have mentioned a number of different activities, but what are your top favorite activities in class?
I've got two, and hopefully we've got
Mhm.
time for me to talk about them. The first one is
Sure.
when I broach the subject of writing and about really getting into writing skills and the idea of building longer, more complex sentences. And I really enjoy doing this. And I did this at the teacher training day in Torun a couple of weeks ago with Glenn
Mhm.
Standish. Very great, a really great event. I love Glenn Standish's stuff. Um, there, I was talking about the same thing about process writing, about getting better sentences. But I do this with my students as well. The writing topic is not what you would expect. It's not about climate change. It's not about sports, anything like that. I say, okay, we're going to write about this classroom. So look around. We're going to start by saying what the classroom looks like and how it's arranged, and then we're going to critique it. We're going to say something that's good about the arrangement of things here and one thing that could be improved. So they get to do some brainstorming, and then we put some notes up on the board, and then we start developing one of those ideas. And again, they do it in collaboration with their partner. The aim of that lesson is really just to get, maybe in the scope of the lesson, it's just to get a couple of good sentences on the board so that the students know how to do it, and then they can do the next couple of sentences at home. But imagine it's
Mhm.
a 90-minute lesson, it's a writing lesson, and our target is 2 or 3 sentences. And I feel that's how it should be, because most students aren't ready to write 200 words because they can't write 20 words well. So
Mm.
I would say that's the first thing. And the second is a corrective of my own to the dismal state of affairs in course books. And if anyone out there is a course book writer, please take this on board. I've had conversations with people about this before, and they've actually said, well, actually, yeah, that's a fair point, and we try to avoid that where possible. But so imagine the situation like you're doing, I don't know, a C1 advanced lesson. A lot of teachers teaching C1 advanced will know the book I'm talking about. There's this page long reading, and it's about this guy that wanted to be like a polar explorer or something like that. Um,
Mhm.
his adventures from his youth to this latest attempt at reaching the pole. And at the end of that reading, after the reading comprehension questions, the text itself is well written. I have to admit, it's a well written text, and it's not a grammar delivery text either. It's just a text for its own sake with the comprehension questions. The task that follows on from that is a speaking task. What would you do if you were this person? How would you approach this problem? And you could read the questions for this speaking task and answer them convincingly without ever having read the text, which for me is a huge missed opportunity, because you've got this really nicely written text. It's at the level, it's got some great bits of language. There might be a vocabulary exercise in there somewhere, but generally there's a text and there's a response to the topic. Now, that's the wrong thing, because reading does not lead to speaking. If you spoke like you just read, you would sound terrible. So what I do is I get my students to look back at the text. I divide it up into maybe paragraphs or longer chunks. And I say, okay, writing is formulaic. We know that. This group, look at this section. Go through. Can you find any chunks of language that you want to steal? When you found it, think of a recent writing task that we did together, maybe as homework or just in the class, that you could then put that into. What would the sentence be? So they're taking things like in the reading task, it said, despite his best efforts. So we're going to take that despite someone's best efforts. We're going to lift it and we're going to put it into that writing task we tried last week. And they do that with a couple. And before they know it, they've got 50 or 60 words of chunks. And they just need to kind of like knit the fabric together. And they've got a whole writing in front of them. So that's my second kind of go-to activity, is to go back to a reading that we've done that highlights how texts are made when they're written texts. And we look for the language that works, that we like. We take it and we put it into new writing. And that works very well, because it shows students, if you're not sure where to go with your writing homework, start by just taking a book, open it, find some language that works for you, and take the bones and add the muscles back in.
Interesting, very interesting, and yeah, very good. For me, one of the, and very much similar to what you're talking about, but maybe dictogloss, where it's I tell a story at natural pace. The students just write down keywords, whether it's verbs to begin with, and then adjectives, and then nouns, and then I say, well, we got all this language, and you try and put it back together. You reform it in your as best as you can. But I do like that element where students have the opportunity to use the language that they recognize and are encounter during lessons in that manner.
Well, we do it with speaking, don't we? If we do a listening exercise, it might be because there are some kind of idiomatic language that we want them to learn. So the best example of this is with the Everyday English part of the Own It series. So they have 5 phrases like, oh, you're joking, or something like that. You do the listening. You've got to fit the phrases in as you heard them. So it's just a gap fill thing. And then you come up with a new dialogue that uses these expressions. Well, we do it all the time with speaking. We take a spoken text that we've listened to, and we put it into our speaking. Why not just do the same with reading going into writing? I mean, it's the obvious thing, but I've never seen a course book that really approaches it in the same way, which is a missed opportunity, I'd say.
It is, yeah. Well, I'm afraid we're at the end of we've just run over, but it's been a pleasure to talk to you, Chris, and thank you so much for volunteering to come along and share your passions of writing. And I hope the audience, those that have tuned in for today, have taken away something that they can incorporate into their future lessons as well.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, well, I'm going to leave it there for today. So thank you for everybody who's joined episode 3 of the Sunday Social with myself and Chris here. And I look forward to seeing everybody again for episode 4. and I'll share a bit more information about what the topic might be on LinkedIn and various other social media platforms. But for now, have a lovely and splendid Sunday, and yeah, take
Thank
it
you.
easy. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Outstanding and world-class vision and world-class this.
I'm a real leadership geek, honestly. I've spent my whole career reading books and chatting to people.
I just find the whole thing and the announcement, the way it's been announced, bizarre.
If you could move away from a model where teachers are so intensely focused